Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here, and today I will be doing part 3 of the 4-part series that I have been in the middle of, which is going across each decade in the NBA and identifying the best teams in each conference, and just to sort of help get a better idea of who the dominant teams were in that era. And, was it a case of a team that had the end of a dynasty in the middle of a decade and another one start? Or had a dynasty that sort of just lined up so that it went across the whole span of the decade. So part 3 today is the 2000s, from the years 1999 to 2000 as the first year, and the last year being 2008 to 2009. And I do that because then in each of those seasons the playoffs took place in the 2000s. So in like the 2009 and 2010 season, I would include that, but technically the 2010 playoffs were in the next decade, so I'm not going to be including that season. And yes, the 1999 to 2000 season had part of the regular season in the 90s, but the playoffs took place in the 2000s, so that's how I'm qualifying that. So again, going over what I've gone over before starting these videos, I'm going to rank each team, or not rank them, but go through each team. I'm going to review their average win totals from the regular season during that decade. I got that just by looking at their historical records and averaging their win totals from each of the 10 seasons to get a general idea of how they performed in the regular season. And then also I looked at their playoff success in each of the 10 seasons, and I assigned a number to each round of the playoffs. So if you don't make the playoffs, that's a 0. If you got to the first round and lost, that's a 1. Second round, 2 points. Conference finals, 3 points. If you make it to the finals and lose, that's 4 points. And if you win a championship, that's 5. And so I tallied those scores for each season for each team and got a composite playoff score, which will say who basically did the best in the playoffs. And so I'm going to go through each of those and the average win totals to get a sense of who the best performing teams were from each conference in the 2000s. So I'm going to start off this time with the Western Conference because last time I did the East, so I figured I'd switch it up and do the West this time. So the first team I have on here to review is the Los Angeles Lakers. They were one of the most successful franchises in the NBA during the 2000s. They brought in 4 championships and they had 6 finals appearances, so very impressive. Looking at they won titles from the year 2000 to 2002. They lost in the finals in 2004, lost in the finals in 2008, and then won the championship in 2009. This was an interesting time for the Lakers in that you had the end of the Shaq era and the start of the solo Kobe era. So I'd say it's sort of like 2 dynasties, but really it's one because Kobe is the continuity. But it was a pretty interesting time for them. They made the playoffs every year except for 2005, which is the first year after Shaq and Phil Jackson and Derek Fisher left. But obviously Derek Fisher and Phil Jackson came back 2 years later, and they started having success again. So their composite playoff score is 32, which is the highest of any team in the Western Conference during this decade. This can be largely attributed to the number of championships they won, and they did very well during this decade. Not the most dominant we've seen out of any team, but right up there. And if you're the best team in your conference during a decade, that's something to be really proud of. As far as regular season wins, their average was 53, which is pretty good. It is the 3rd best among teams in the Western Conference during this decade. And so that's highly impressive as well. They actually were not a team that was consistently getting about 50 each season. In the Shaq and Kobe era, they were traditionally getting between about 55 and 60 wins a year. And then when Shaq left, they were more like in the 42, 41, 40 range for a few seasons. And then when Kobe got Pau Gasol, they were back up to like between 57 and mid 60s for wins, so that's very impressive. So moving on from the Lakers, the next team I have is the Portland Trail Blazers, who did not really have that good of a decade, but I included them because they did make the playoffs 5 times. They lost in the first round 4 of those 5 times, but in the 2000 playoffs, they did get to the conference finals with a really good team of Rasheed Wallace, Steve Smith, Scottie Pippen, Damon Stoudemire, Sabonis. So I included them. Their average win total during the regular season was 42 wins, which is normally about a 7 or 8 seed. And they only had a composite playoff score of 7 because of all the first round losses, but they still made it, so that's still something to hang your hat on, but it wasn't really that good. They missed the playoffs a lot. Between 2004 and 2008, they didn't make the playoffs any of those years. It was sort of a time where they were transitioning from the Rasheed Wallace era to the Brandon Roy and LaMarcus Aldridge era, and they didn't really have any great players in the middle, so that's why they had such a big gap. So moving on from them, the next team I have is the Utah Jazz, which I think is one of the most interesting teams of this decade, in that at the start you have the end of an amazing 20-year dynasty of Stockton and Malone, and then middle of the decade you get the start of the Deron Williams era, which was a pretty good era in Utah. So Utah made the playoffs in 7 of the 10 years. They made them from 2000 to 2003, which was the end of the Stockton and Malone era, mainly basically just losing in the first round. And then they missed the playoffs for 3 years, and then they made the conference finals in 2007, which is actually pretty impressive, with Deron Williams and Andre Kirilenko as basically the main guys, and Carlos Boozer as well. That was sort of an upset team, I thought, to get that far. It was mainly because the Mavericks were the 1 seed and lost in the first round. So in the second round, the Jazz only faced the 8 seed, and so they had a bit of an easier path. But still, if you get there, you get there, and it doesn't really matter how. Besides that, they lost in the first round quite a bit, and were decent in the regular season. They averaged 46 wins a year in the regular season, which is about a 5 seed in the West during this time period, which is pretty good. And when I looked at their playoff seeding, they were normally like the 4 or the 5, just for reference. So yeah, that's about what they were. A 4 and a 5 seed on average that maybe got to the first or maybe second round. So moving on, the San Antonio Spurs are my next team. They have the second highest playoff composite score of 29, which is pretty good, and they have an average win total of 58, which is the highest of any team in this conference during the decade. They just were a model of consistency. It was highly impressive. They made the playoffs every season. Only twice did they lose in the first round. Every other year they got farther. And this is actually kind of weird, but I noticed a pattern in that 2002 lost in the second round, 2003 won the championship. 2004 lost in the second round, 2005 championship winner. 2006 lost in the second round, 2007 championship winner. That's an interesting 6-year pattern that I thought was kind of cool. There's no logic to it, but it's just interesting to me. They lost in the conference finals in 2008, lost in the first round in 2009. They had 3 championships, which is less than the Lakers' 4 during this decade. But I would actually argue that this was more of the Spurs decade than the Lakers, because they were always in it, and it was sort of a thing where, maybe the Lakers were more dominant for a shorter period of time, but the Spurs were always there and always ready to be the team that took over in case another team crumbled a little bit. What I mean by this is, the year that the Lakers don't win the championship during their string of titles is the year the Spurs win. The Suns in 2005 were the dominant team that everyone thought was going to win it all, and they had some slip-ups in the playoffs. Spurs win it. 2006 to 2007, the Mavericks get upset, and we're all sort of well, who's going to win it now? Spurs win it. They're always sort of there to take the place of the team that falls short on their expectations, which I don't think is a bad thing whatsoever. It's very good. It just means that they're always in it and always going to compete. This is the height of the Duncan, Ginobili, Parker era, and they were just a dominant team overall. The next team I have is the Dallas Mavericks, who are the definitive third best team of the Western Conference during this decade. They had a playoff composite score of 18. They had an average regular season win total of 55, which is very good. And the Mavericks, they made the finals in 06 and lost when I think that they probably should have won that. They were probably the better altogether team, but they just couldn't do it. And then they got upset the next year in the first round when they were like the clear-cut title favorites. So fell a little bit short of expectations there. But for the most part in this decade, I really saw the Mavericks as a stepping stone. This sounds bad, but I don't think it's really that bad. Excuse me there. But if you just look at some of their playoff finishes, they were losing in the second round a lot, and it was often to the team that really catapulted and did well later on. So in 03, for instance, the Spurs win the title and the Mavericks lose to them in the conference finals. In 02, the Kings are like the dominant team on a mission, and the Mavericks lose to them. In 01, I think they lost to the Spurs, but the Spurs made the conference finals. So, I guess it sounds like obvious that if you lose to a team, they're going to go farther than you. But it seemed like in a lot of these scenarios, the team that they lost to was the one that maybe went on to win the title or something. In 05, they lost to the, let's see here. In 05, they lost to the Suns, but the Suns didn't go on and win the title. But the Suns were the team to beat that year, and it's sort of like teams had to beat the Mavs to prove that they were legit or something, because the Mavs were like the stepping stone for everybody. So Mavericks did really good. I feel like they could have done a lot better, but they were always there, like the Spurs were. They made the playoffs in 9 of the 10 years, and they were always doing well in the regular season too. So they were just very consistent and very solid. The next team I have is the Phoenix Suns, who at times did really good in this decade, and at times were not that good. This decade for them is really defined by Steve Nash being the 2-time MVP and leading them to the playoffs. They had a composite playoff score of 13, which is 4th best among these teams. So you could say on average they were around a 4 seed maybe, or about that. And they had an average win total in the regular season of 49, which is pretty decent. It's obviously ticked up a little bit because they had a few 60-plus win seasons with Nash. The 04 to 07 is their best stretch, because they, like 04, 05, 05, 06, 06, 07. They made the conference finals in 2 of the years, and in the year that they didn't, they were still a 61-win team. So that was just a great 3-year stretch of success. Often considered one of the best eras to never make even a finals appearance, because they were just so good and had a great offense and never were able to just get over the hump. A little bit like the Mavericks, but the Mavericks did eventually get over the hump. But this Suns team just could never do it, and they had great players. They just could not put it together when it mattered the most for some reason. Moving on from them, the next team I have is Sacramento Kings, who I think are a very interesting team for this decade, in that they had a little bit of an era or a dynasty, you might say, but it was cut short because in the 04 playoffs, Chris Webber went down with a really bad back injury and was never the same after that, which is really unfortunate. He was one of the best power forwards in the game, and just after that injury, he was never the same player again, never as dominant. Relied on outside jumpers more than getting to the hoop, and still had a good handling of the ball, but just his explosiveness went away a lot for the most part. And he went into his 30s at that point, so he wasn't as good either. But their playoff composite score was 12, which is decent. They basically lost in the first and second round every year for the first half of the decade, and then got to the conference finals the one time when they lost to the Lakers in a very controversial series. And they had an average regular season win total of 46, which is pretty decent. Their best year, they won 61 games in 02, and everyone thought that they should have won the title. Again, one of my favorite teams to not win a title. I think that they are amazing. And just to watch, if you've ever gone back and watched some of their old games, oh, it's just so fun. Either with Jason Williams at point guard or Mike Bibby at point guard, those two guys play a bit differently. Williams was all about pass first, and Bibby could score pretty well if he had to, but he's also a decent facilitator if he had to. But they had so much ball movement that it just was amazing. And Chris Webber was he wasn't a point forward, I wouldn't say, because he didn't bring the ball down the court really, but they would facilitate the offense through him in that he would be at the top of the key, and they would give him the ball, and then people would run plays, and he would be the distributor. So it was a pretty cool system. Yeah, that was a great era. And then it ended at around 06. They traded away some guys, and they traded Stojakovic for Ron Artest, and he did okay for 1 year. They made the playoffs, I think, but then after that, they were a pretty bad team. Bibby got old and got traded, and Divac retired, and Webber got traded, so it all fell apart for them. But they were a decent team, and I feel like another team where it's like, man, if only they would have gotten that one break. But, I don't know, the NBA seemed to have something against them in that series with the Lakers, so I guess we'll never really know how good they could have been. So that's the Western Conference. A great decade in the West. It was primarily dominated by the Lakers and Spurs, but you still had a lot of other competitive teams. And it was really the decade of the power forward, I feel like. The Spurs, the Mavs, the Suns and the Kings, and even the Jazz for a little while, all were relying on power forwards. Tim Duncan, Dirk, Chris Webber. I mean, the Suns had Steve Nash, but Amari too. Amari was there before Steve. The Jazz had Karl Malone for about the first half of the decade. So yeah, Carlos Boozer later for the Jazz. So yeah, all those teams were reliant on power forwards. It was really a golden age of power forwards in the game. All right, so now I'm going to transition to do the Eastern Conference, which I think is a very underrated decade and conference. I was really talking up the Western Conference in the 1990s in my last video, but I would argue that the East is honestly just as good, and I think it's in this decade, in the 2000s. And I think it's ironic because, or not ironic, but just interesting that people often call this about the worst decade of any conference. Is like, oh, the Eastern Conference in the 2000s was so weak, blah, 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 blah. But, it was weaker than the West, yes. But was it entertaining? Yes, it was very entertaining. Just for reference here, out of the 10 years that I'm talking about, there were 8 different teams that went to the finals. So no, there wasn't any miraculous dynasty over the decade, but I honestly like parity better than a dynasty because I think if you don't just already know the team that's going to the finals, there's a lot more excitement to it. So yeah, that's my stance on the whole thing. And yeah, so you had a really good mix of teams, some interesting matchups and rivalries that developed, and let's get into it. So the first team I'm going to talk about is probably the best team during this decade, the most consistent, is the Detroit Pistons. They made the playoffs in 9 out of the 10 years, and they had an amazing 6-year streak where they either got to the conference finals, the finals, or won a title from 03 to 08, which I think is pretty good. So they won the title in 04, they got to the finals in 05, and the other years they lost in the conference finals. This era primarily made up of the Billups, Rip Hamilton, Tayshaun Prince, Rasheed Wallace, and Ben Wallace core. Ben Wallace left after the 2005-2006 season, and they still did well, but it just wasn't the same after that. They were still good, just not as good, but oh well. They are one of my favorite teams of all time, just that era. I liked all those guys a lot. I really liked the whole idea of playing better than the sum of your parts, which is what they did. So yeah, they were just a picture of excellence in that time in the Eastern Conference. Average wins of 50 per year because they were a little bit lower on either end of that 6-year run, but they were pretty high. Their best season in the regular season was 05-06. They won 64 games. and they were the 1 seed. So yeah, they had a playoff composite score of 25, which is pretty good, best in the conference during the decade. And so I'm going to move on from them. Next team I have is the Pacers, who did well for the first part of the decade, but didn't do as well later on. They made the finals in 2000, which is good. But besides that, they basically lost in the first round for most of the time or didn't make the playoffs. They did make the conference finals in 04, which is when they had Artest and Reggie Miller and Jermaine O'Neal as the primary guys on the team, and Al Harrington as well. So that was a good year for them. They averaged 44 wins, which is a bit lower than you might think because they didn't make the playoffs in the last few years of the decade. But that team in 2000 that lost to the Lakers in the finals, oh, that's one of my favorite teams. You have Sam Perkins, Chris Mullin coming off the bench, and then your starters are like Mark Jackson, Jalen Rose, Reggie Miller, Rick Smits, and I don't remember who the power forward was, but maybe one of the Davis brothers, or not, they're not brothers, but maybe Dale Davis, or maybe he had left by then, but either way, a very good team. I don't think Detlef Schrempf, he was on the Trailblazers at the time, but a really cool team, lots of firepower. I like Jalen Rose as a player a lot. I think he's very underrated. So yeah, that was a really good team, but they just could not get over the hump like a lot of other teams. Next team I have is the Miami Heat. Oh, Pacers had a composite playoff score of 13, by the way, which is decent. It's kind of along the lines of a lot of these other teams during this decade. That's a parity. Next team I have is Miami Heat, who won the title in 06 finals. Besides that, though, they did not do that well during this decade. They made the conference finals the year before that, but besides that, they missed the playoffs a decent amount or just lost in the first or second round. So it's not like they made a ton of late playoff pushes, which I think people assume when they think, oh, the Shaq and Wade era. But that was really like a 2-year era. Even in their third year of being together, they lost in the first round and only won 44 games, which is not that good. The Heat also had some really bad years, which is how they got players like Wade. They had only an average win total of 42 over the decade, which is like a 8 seed or a 7 seed on average. So yeah, the Heat had a decade of really highs and really lows. So yeah. The Boston Celtics, the next team I have. Oh, the Heat had a playoff composite score of 15, by the way. I keep forgetting that. Next team I have is the Celtics, who had a similar decade of a lot of highs and a lot of lows. They had a playoff composite score of 13, an average win total in regular season of 43, which is okay. And actually in the Eastern Conference during this time, that's about good enough to be a 4 seed on average, which is crazy to think about, but it's true. The Celtics got to the conference finals in 02, which I think might actually be one of the weakest teams to ever make a conference finals. I should actually do a video on that because I think that there's a lot of teams that get to the Final Four and they really are just not that good sometimes. Okay, yeah, the Celtics is an example of that, or maybe the Jazz that I was talking about in 07 making the conference finals. That's a really weak team to make it that far. But yeah, I think that those are some good examples. But so the Celtics made the conference finals that year. They lost in the first round and second round a few times. And the main reason that they're on this list is that they won the title in 08. And as I always say, if a team wins the title, you have to put them on the list of best teams during the decade, no matter how they did in the other years. So they were a lot of highs and a lot of lows. And they missed the playoffs in 5 of the 10 years, so they weren't that good for a lot of the time. Next team I have is the New Jersey Nets, who had a playoff composite score of 15 and are one of the 2 teams besides the Pistons to make the finals more than once out of this whole conference during the decade. They had an average win total of 41 during the regular season, which sounds really bad, and that's because they missed the playoffs in 4 of the 10 years, and they had a really good stretch from 02 to 2007, but in the 2 years on either end, they did pretty bad. But in the middle there, you had a good stretch with a core of Jason Kidd and Richard Jefferson, and then after 04 you had Vince Carter as well. So that is impressive to me. They got to the finals twice in 02 and 03, lost to the Lakers and Spurs, and that was at the height of Jason Kidd's prime. He did really well. But after that, they were basically a second round lost team. You know, I always thought that getting Vince Carter would help them improve, but they really, I don't know what the deal was. And Richard Jefferson improved a lot too, but they just could not get over the hump. Yeah, I don't know. They were sort of like the Mavs of the East. If you remember me talking about the Mavs being sort of like the stepping stone, that was what the Nets were, except when they made the finals the 2 years, there was really no one to step over, so they were the team that made it then. A team that I think would be sort of similar to the Raptors of this decade. You know, they're always there, but they're never making it that far unless there's like nobody in their way. Sort of like the Knicks of the 90s as well. Made the finals when no one was there to compete, but when people were there, they were more like a stepping stone. The next team I have is the Orlando Magic with a playoff composite score of 10 and an average win total of 41 during the regular season. So this is interesting. It's the combination of two eras, the Tracy McGrady era in the early half of the decade and the Dwight Howard at the bookend of the decade with playoff success at least. I don't know if I said it, but playoff composite score of 10, which is all right. It's the lowest of any of the teams I have on here. But I feel like they made the playoffs in 6 of the 10 years, so I might as well include them. They lost in the first round 4 of those years, lost in the second round in 08, and then 09 finally broke through and got to the finals. Only their second time they've ever done that, and I don't know, they were just a really good team that year, built perfectly. Dwight and a bunch of shooters, so that was like the modern, that was like the first incarnation, I want to say, of the modern NBA. You could argue that the Suns in the mid-2000s were like that as well. But also, okay, I'll say the Suns and the Magic were the first two to have that sort of imprint and idea. T-Mac could never get out of the first round on the Magic. He really had no help around him whatsoever. That's why he was leading the league in scoring for a few seasons there. At 28 one year and then at 32 the next year. You know, if he would have had Grant Hill healthy, it could have been a different story. It would have been a different story. And if they would have gotten Tim Duncan in the offseason of 2000 like they were supposed to, it would have been a way different story. If you guys don't know, Tim Duncan was like on the verge of signing with the Magic in 2000 along with Tracy McGrady and Grant Hill, but because of a really stupid reason, he didn't sign with them. And you can look it up for yourself, or maybe I'll make a video in the future about it, but basically the Magic should have had him, and because of some little stupid thing, he didn't sign with them. But if he would have, their playoff composite score would have been a heck of a lot higher than 10, I can tell you that. Average of 41 wins in the regular season because they, again, had a lot of seasons where they were always basically between about 35 and 45 wins during this period, except for the year that they got to the finals. But besides that, they were always in that range. And so the last team I have is the Philadelphia 76ers, who had a pretty mixed decade. They made the playoffs in 7 of the years, made the finals in 01 with Iverson and Mutombo. Iverson got traded away in let's see here. I want to say 05 to 06 he got traded away, or 06 to 07. Probably, actually, yeah, it was 06 to 07, I think. But, you know, they were a good team during the early half. They were losing the second round a few times, first round a few times. End of the decade, the Andre Iguodala era took over. They had a playoff composite score of 12, which is right there in the middle of the pack with all the rest of these teams. And they had an average win total of 43 during the regular season, which is pretty decent for the East during this time period. You know, they built their team in a way that I don't think was smart, but oh well. They just surrounded Iverson with a bunch of role players. They did good in that they got to the finals once, but they could have been a lot better of a team. They got Chris Webber in a trade in 2004, well after, like a year after he was out of his prime. So he didn't do that well for them, but at least they tried, I guess. I don't know. I feel like they squandered Iverson's prime is why I sound maybe a bit more negative about the 76ers, but I guess they got to the finals, so that's pretty good. So that's all I have for the Eastern Conference thing, guys. The Pistons as probably the clear best team, and then maybe you'd say the Nets as the second best team during the decade. And the rest kind of had periods of being really good or really bad. And that's the NBA in the 2000s, both the Western and Eastern Conference. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll be getting to you soon with part 4 of the series. And I hope you guys have been enjoying this video and the previous 2 as well. Alright guys, see ya.